What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, man. And as you guys know, these double eye swides I'm doing, I just keep dropping them back and forth. But recently I just did a couple LG phones, the LG V20, and surprisingly I used to drop these like back to back. So I used to drop like an LG V10, then the V20, then the V30, whatever. But I kind of did it backwards because I had to redeem myself from the last year V20 video. But the LG V10 was the predecessor to the V20, and in my opinion, when the LG V10 came out, I saw a lot of coverage about it, but before I even started this channel and before I could just go out and just randomly just buy a phone, this phone came out, and I think at this time I had the LG G2, and I will tell you, when the V10 came out, the way this phone just kind of sucked me in was crazy, because I saw this, I'm like, man, this is a crazy phone, and I began to think, I'm like, why would anybody else buy any other sort of phone? I think the Galaxy Note 5 was out at the time, or I think it was the Note 5, and I was still like, why would anybody buy those phones when the LG V10 seemed like a much better device? I mean, it had so much more to offer than a lot of these other phones, so I thought. And again, this was back in 2015, I kind of know a lot more now than I did then, but I'll definitely say that the LG V10 really, when it released, had a special place in my heart, especially considering the fact I think I had an LG phone at the time. But I mean, just looking around, man, this thing, like I said, was released in 2015, so it'll turn 4 years old this year in October. So right now it's about 3 years and some change. And the overall body, in my opinion, the front, I mean, I'll definitely say this phone is kind of built in a weird way. I'm not going to say it feels cheap, but I don't necessarily think it feels like the most premium thing ever. The sides are stainless steel, so it's pretty cool. Like, it feels pretty premium when you hold it that way. But the back is actually plastic, but it is removable, and I'll get into that in a second. But the back itself is kind of cool. I really like this design. It kind of gives it like a rugged feel. Like, it has this like checkered plastic kind of, it's kind of hard to explain, you kind of have to feel it, but it's not like a generic plastic back. It definitely feels like you have some grip to it, and that's one thing I really liked about this phone. And me personally, I mean, I always like a premium built phone. I like glass on the back sometimes. I mean, I think it's just one more part to break, but I would rather take a plastic back with a removable back and a removable battery and removable storage than not having that at all and just having a glass back. So that's kind of my opinion on it. But again, not the best built phone, but I totally understand where it's coming from, because you do get the removable back and the removable battery. So I'd rather have that when all is said and done. Now, there were a couple different variants of this. There was a single SIM version, then there was a dual SIM version. Just depending on which one you get, you will have those type of capabilities on them. Now, the screen itself is actually 5.7 inches, it's 1440p, and it is IPS, but the PPI is pretty high at 515 pixels per inch. And all those specs said and done, I definitely think that this is still a pretty big phone in the hands. But again, that might be a pro to a lot of you. For me, I like a bigger phone, so I definitely like the size of this thing. But the interesting thing about this was that it had an extra secondary display on top of that, so it was like 2.1 inches. The resolution of that was 160 by 1040, and that was also an IPS panel. And I said this in the V20 video, and I'll say it again here, like, I really wish they kind of put AMOLED on this, at least on the secondary lens, just because that panel is always on, and it could have saved a little bit more battery that way. But again, it is what it is. And I think in a way, the secondary screen was a cool feature. It was almost a gimmick, but not really, because it did add some kind of functionality to it, but it was also like, what more can you do with it, in a way, like, in the best way I can put it, because it didn't really add any more extra features versus than just having something like always on display or something like that, you know what I mean? But I don't think it's a horrible thing. I'm glad they put it in. Phone manufacturers pushing the boundaries and things like that is something I always appreciate. So, I'm not gonna hate on it. You can use it if you want to, you don't have to use it, but that's pretty much that. That's pretty much on the outside. This thing did take micro USB, so there was no USB-C on this, but this still had a headphone jack, so that's super cool. Now, that's kind of covering the outside and everything like that. Now, I kind of want to delve into software, but there's really not too much to add here. It started off with Android Lollipop, which was 5.1.1. It eventually got Android Nougat, which was 7.0, and it didn't go any further than that. And this is a practical phone where I would be like, go custom ROM it, go root it, this and that. But the sad thing is that there's not that much of a huge community in terms of development behind it. So I think like not that many people own the LG V10 anymore, and there is a root out for it, so that's really cool. You can install Twerp or Clockwork Mod, whatever that is, whichever one this one supports. I'm pretty sure it supports both of them. But in terms of the development community behind it, I couldn't necessarily find too many ROMs for it. I'm sure there's an Android Oreo ROM out for it, but I'm looking right now even on XDA, and there's really not too much going on. I mean, whether you look in the Android development or the original Android development, there's a couple different ROMs out there, but most of them seem kind of outdated. I mean, here's one from the 15th of August. It's an Android 8.1 ROM. There's no Android Pie ROMs that I can see, some Android Nougat ROMs, so that's kind of sad. I mean, that's one thing I always recommend people to do, is custom ROM your phone outside, if it's outside of its software lifecycle. But in this case, there's not too many choices, so kind of a sad thing, but it is what it is. But again, I would always recommend doing your own research. Maybe there's some other websites out there with custom ROMs that are just not on XDA, which is kind of not usual, but that kind of covers the software and the outside of the phone. Let's go ahead and talk about more of the internals and kind of the speed and performance of this phone. And I'll just say the specs like I always do, but I kind of want to talk about the performance after. And this thing had the Qualcomm Snapdragon 808 chipset, a hexa-core CPU, an Adreno 418 GPU, and 4 gigs of RAM. And what I'll tell you is that with all this said and done, this phone, in my opinion, is still pretty decent. Now, LG's UI, as I said before, is kind of weird. I think this user interface is different than the one I was getting on like my LG G4 and G5, which was released around the same time. So I think LG kind of made their own for this phone, or maybe I'm doing something wrong. I'm kind of stupid, but I definitely think that the way this phone is just performing is pretty decent. I don't think it's horrible at all. You probably are used to hearing me say that, but again, I'm not like some huge like tester or anything. I don't think people necessarily need like the latest and greatest phones. I'm not really comparing this phone to like an iPhone XS Max when I'm using it. I'm kind of comparing it like, is it slow? Do I notice it being slow? Is it this? Is it that? And because I had mine on Android Nougat, I didn't really, I guess the software is already optimized for this specific hardware. It's not optimized for like the Android Pies where it's like 8 gigs of RAM and this and that. So I think if you kept it stock and if you kept it on Android Nougat, I really don't think you're going to have too many problems with it. I think the performance is definitely not a horrible thing. This thing does have 4 gigs of RAM, so that's pretty high up there, whether you're multitasking. And again, like my usage isn't even that crazy. So I definitely do think that the performance on this phone isn't horrible at all. It's definitely on the better side of things for sure. One thing you might notice here and there is that there might be some cases where you might see some apps like not just being glitchy and glitchy animations and slow animations here and there. But again, there's not too much to complain about when you factor in how old this phone is, especially the price tag of this phone right now. So I don't think it's a horrible device at all in terms of performance. And even going into gaming, casual games run perfectly fine. Heavier intensive games are kind of iffy here and there. There's some glitched frames for sure. But I will say you could 100% finish a game with this, so I don't think it's a horrible thing. As long as your performance and your usage isn't even that high or anything like that, you should be set. So when all said and done in terms of the performance, I definitely don't think it's a horrible thing. I definitely think that if you're going to get this phone, the performance is probably one of those things you aren't going to be mad at. There's some other things to be mad at, but just not the performance, man. Now let's go ahead and talk about the camera. This thing has a single sensor on the back. It's 16 megapixels. You can shoot 4K videos on it, and you can shoot 1080p videos on it too, of course. You do have optical image stabilization and laser autofocus. Now, what I'll tell you is for my specific usage, again, I'm not a humongous photographer. I'm not trying to test and all these different things. I'm just saying, like, is it a good camera? Is it not? And what I'll tell you is that this camera is definitely good. I don't really have any problems with it. Again, like I stated, this is a very safe phone in a way in terms of the camera. I always found that LG had very good sensors on their older phones. Even now, their phones are pretty good too in terms of the cameras. But I do think there was a time where LG's cameras were up there with like Samsung's and Apple's. And right now, I would definitely still say that the 2015 flagships of Apple's and Samsung's were better than this. I definitely do think that the LG V10 had a very good sensor in it for the time being, and I still think it kind of holds up now, so I'll definitely give it that. Interesting thing though is that it does have a dual camera setup on the front, which is something that we're seeing now with the new Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus, so that's kind of funny how that kind of goes like full circle. So it does have a dual 5 megapixel sensor on top, and you can shoot 1080p videos on it, and I'll definitely say that the front camera isn't horrible. I've seen a lot of worse cameras in 2015 than this one, even the 2015 flagships. So in terms of the front and back cameras, I'll definitely give it a thumbs up. I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's horrible. I think it's definitely a plus for this phone overall. Now, in terms of the battery life, this thing on stock had a 3000 mAh battery, and I'll definitely say that the battery life probably wasn't the greatest because this phone was pretty spec heavy. It had a pretty large screen, a pretty high resolution, high PPI, and I definitely think that in terms of that, it's not necessarily the best battery life of a 2015 phone, but again, one of the best things about this phone was the removable battery, and that's something that still carries over to today. So if you're planning on getting an LG V10, really you just need to keep in mind that this phone will still be able to swap out the battery and you can put in the same 3000 mAh battery, or even go and get an extended battery, so you can get like a 4000, 5000, whatever they manufacture. You can just go out and get that instead, and that's something I always preach to people. I'm like, there's no reason ever to like have a horrible battery life on a phone that has a removable battery. I even know like the Galaxy Note 3 that came out forever ago, that thing on stock didn't have horrible battery life, but you can go out and get like a 10,000 mAh battery on it, and if my phone had a removable battery, I would 100% do that. So in terms of battery life, on stock it would probably be like a 5 out of 10, but because it does have a removable battery, it easily bumps it up to like an 8 out of 10, man. Now, some other notable things to note, this thing does have a fingerprint sensor on the back, which is really cool. I love that. In 2015, we still kind of saw some phone manufacturers not releasing phones with fingerprint sensors. So the fact that this thing does have that kind of made it a little bit more future-proofed. There was no IP certification on this as far as I can tell, so there was no water resistance. Maybe you can go get a water resistant case or something, I don't know. And this last thing I kind of want to hit on, I hate talking about it because the people who, use this phone and love this phone, I've used it, I liked it. It kind of rubs them the wrong way, but I have to say it. This phone, as well as many other LG phones, suffered from the boot looping issue. So what this means is that the phone would not boot up past the LG logo once you turn it on for the first time. So that's kind of annoying, and that would just really suffer. I would be suffered if that were to happen to me, especially with my iPhone 10, because I have so much stuff on my phone. If I weren't able to get past that, how would I recover those things? I understand iCloud and stuff, but it would just be a humongous annoying thing. And this phone did have that issue. Now, what I'll definitely say is that if you currently own an LG V10, good for you. But in my usage, I owned the LG G2 for a long time. And I say this every time I bring up this boot looping issue. I never thought that my phone would have it, because even when I retired it, I still kind of used it here and there when I switched to an iPhone. And it wasn't until after I did that, a couple months later, the phone started actually boot looping and I got the touch disease problem and everything. I was able to circumvent that somehow. I don't even remember how I did it, but it did suffer from not only the boot looping issue, but also the touch disease problem. So I'll definitely say that maybe if you're feeling a little risky, you don't care this and that, you don't think it's going to happen, the V10 isn't a horrible phone. I think it's very good. It still has a lot of things with it, but that boot looping issue was one of those things that always scares me to recommend people a phone that could have the potential to just brick and not able to work to its full potential. And I would hate to be the reason why you were to pick up a phone that did that. So you have the facts. You can go pick up a V10 if you want to, but what I'll definitely say is that there's some other phones out there that will be able to, do the justice of the V10. The LG G6, as far as I know, doesn't have that widespread of a boot looping issue as well as the G7, but also the Google Pixel. That's a very good phone. I'll leave links to the G6, G7, and the Google Pixel XL in the description below. Even maybe a Galaxy S8 Plus. Those phones are very, very good phones, and I think those are probably better options than the V10, but I don't think the V10 is a bad phone at all, man. Again, I'll find the cheapest ones on Amazon and I'll leave them straight in the link below. Definitely get them through those links because it helps us support the channel and do more giveaways and reviews, videos, and all that stuff, man. But that is pretty much it. If you have any questions or anything like that, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit that like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it'll mean so much if you guys could hit that. Also, check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys could check it out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. And hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.